What is that? What do you call that thing?
That's it. The Thing. Yeah, you think this is bad, you should have seen him before.
Okay. Now I'm gonna go kill him.
Hey guys, welcome back to Rewind Reviews. Today we're going all the way back to 1982 to take a look at John Carpenter's The Thing. The remake of 1951's The Thing from Another World is an adaptation of the 1938 novel Who Goes There by John Campbell. The Thing sees a research team in Antarctica being hunted by a shape-shifting alien that assumes the appearance of its victims. Directed by John Carpenter, with a screenplay from Bill Lancaster and based on a story by John Campbell Jr., the movie stars Kurt Russell, Wilfred Brimley, T.K. Carter, David Clennon, Keith David, Richard Dysart, Charles Hallahan, Peter Maloney, Richard Monsieur, Donald Moffat, Joel Polis and Thomas Waits. This is one of those true icon movies. It's such a classic that there are so many movies and TV shows I've seen over the past few years that have been heavily influenced or inspired by it in some way, and it's always really strange going back to these kind of movies and seeing where a lot of the inspiration comes from, because you're so familiar with like the tropes and the tricks and everything that it came up with. And I've got to be honest, I was quite surprised finding out that it was actually a remake, because you would assume that a movie like this was a completely new original thing, but no, it's not. It is a remake of this 1950 movie. And full disclosure, I haven't seen that version of the movie, so I can't necessarily compare what it is that this movie did that's differently. By all accounts, by everything that I've heard, this is definitely a much better adaptation. So starting off with the cast, this is a pretty star-studded cast for today's audiences, because these are some pretty big names, especially people like Kurt Russell and Keith David. The performances are one of the reasons why this movie works as well as it does. They are very believable. And one of the reasons for that is that they actually feel like actual humans. They aren't just written as characters. They all have their own little personalities, they all have little things that makes them tick, and I think the way that they react to the situation is very believable. Everyone has a different kind of reaction to it, and I think that is kind of how most people will react if something like this does happen. They are a team of researchers. They are, I wouldn't necessarily say they are all the smartest, but they do behave smartly, and I think that the way that they approach the situation is smart, because they do think about things and they do react pretty quickly when things do happen. It's a really odd thing to praise, but considering how many horror movies I've seen where the characters all like split up and they do all those stupid tropes, and it's just these characters that are just idiots. So it's nice to actually have something that's a bit different and actually contrasts from what we've seen a lot of today. Very quickly, I do want to mention that I'm going to try and keep this as spoiler free as possible, but I will be going over a few mild spoilers here and there, so if you haven't seen the movie, honestly I'd recommend checking it out, making sure you have a look at it before you come back and have a look at this review. But honestly, there are things that I do want to sort of talk about, so I can't really help not spoiling anything, but I'm going to try and avoid the twists and surprises as much as I can. So with that being said, let's move on to the story. So when it comes to the basic plot for this movie, it's very simple, it's very straightforward. It is all about survival. It is a character-driven movie where it basically relies on what the characters are doing. This creature is basically hunting them down one by one, and they've got to try and not only outsmart it, but just survive, because this is a very intense movie that relies very much on paranoia. The Thing, whatever it's called, it's never given like an official name. It's able to basically replicate people to the point where it can convince you that it is your best friend. It's so well executed, and I think the smartest thing that they do is that even the person who is the Thing doesn't necessarily seem to be aware that they are. It helps make the film feel very unpredictable. You can't quite tell what direction that this movie is going to take. And in many ways it is quite subversive as well. When it comes to the pacing, this is a very well paced movie, because it starts off quite slow and it just gradually builds up over time, and then when things really do start kicking off, it doesn't start going faster, but it does pick up the pace a bit more. It does maintain a lot of that dread throughout. The build up to a lot of the more horrifying scenes, it is not only it's done incredibly well, but it's not only just that, it's a case of how well it's able to pay things off as well, because there are so many times where there have been movies that have some brilliant setups, but the actual payoff's a bit boring, and it just doesn't quite land in the way that you were hoping it would be. This is one of the few times where I've actually seen where the payoff really does work, and I think it enhances a lot of those scenes. Like, one of my favourite scenes is the test scene where they're all trying to find out who the thing is, and the way that that scene's built up, it manages to sort of trick you enough into not being entirely sure what the outcome of this scene's going to be. And the way that it builds this scene up, it puts all these different obstacles in the way that when the payoff actually does happen and you reveal who the thing is, it builds off of everything that's happened in that scene to the point where, like, the thing is coming after them, and then because they've all been sort of like tied down just in case one of them ends up turning, and then you realise, oh god, they're all trapped and they can't get out of this. It is really well done. It really adds to the intensity of this film. I do have to wonder how much influence this movie had from things like Alien, because I think it was like 1979, and of course they are like sci-fi horror movies, so of course there is going to be some sort of connection there. It's just the way that the Alien was kind of built up in a similar way. It takes its time to really sort of get going, maybe just a little too long. But I think The Thing does borrow that in a way. It sort of takes its time to get going, establishes who the characters are, where they are, and it's even got like the computer program that's sort of advising them what to do. So there is definitely elements of Alien in this. And one thing that I really do like about the opening sequence is that it really establishes where this movie is going to be taking place, because it takes place in the Antarctic. So it's just this big barren snowy wasteland with mountains all around them. And the opening sequence is a helicopter flying across the snow, and it's just the way that you can see all like these big visuals of the surroundings, and you really get an idea of just how isolated these characters are. So it really does build up how alone that they do feel. And I love the setting for this movie because it's so different from what we would normally see in a movie like this, because there's so many times where it's being in like a factory or some sort of like mechanical place, or just like a generic sci-fi setting. So it is a really great contrast from a lot of those kind of movies and stories, especially when it comes to like the colour scheme as well, because it is very pale. It's white, it's blue, it's just got that sort of coldness that just oozes off the screen. But then when they've got like fire going off or their flares, and it's just like this big gorgeous red glow to it, it looks great, and I think that it really does help cement this as something visually interesting. If you see a screenshot from this movie, you'll know exactly what it's from. When it comes to the actual horror in this movie, I feel like this is definitely one of the ones that's done in a better direction, because this kind of builds more on tension rather than just like grossing you out, even though it does have some pretty horrific moments like that. It really feeds off the uncertainty of what the characters are feeling, because you don't know where the thing is, you don't know what's going to happen next, and that's why this movie is a really great horror film. It's tense and it builds up a lot of the more horrific scenes, but one of the things that I do kind of appreciate is that it isn't just like a jump scare every 5 minutes. It does have a few jump scares in there, and I will admit there's 2 that got me the first time that I watched this. That to me is what a horror movie needs to be. It isn't necessarily just a case of just catching you off guard every 5 minutes. It's about getting you to feel scared. It's about getting you to not know what the outcome is going to be. This is a genuinely great movie when it comes to uncertainty and just being unpredictable. To get prepared for this review, this is the second time that I've actually watched this movie. I can't tell you how much of that unpredictability is kind of important to how scary the movie can be, because once you know those big frightening scenes, then it doesn't really bother you from that point on. So it is one of those ones that I would recommend going in blind. Like if you have like a basic understanding of what the movie's going to be about, it still has those elements that can shock you, and it is surprising in many different ways. Very quickly, I do want to mention that I'm actually quite impressed with the dogs in this film, because honestly they are genuinely great, and I think that the way that the dogs were properly like looked after while they were filming this, and it is great how they are actually used in the movie, because they do kind of sow the seeds of how terrifying this thing is, because I like huskies, and seeing them being in peril, it does sort of make you a lot more on edge, because you really don't want to see things go wrong, especially when it comes to dogs. Now that I've mentioned the dogs, I can do a smooth transition into the effects, because one of the things that they really do well in this movie are the effects. They are a little dated. It is going to happen eventually, and they do look fake, but you still buy into what it is that's happening. You got like the dummies flying around that are supposed to be the people, and you've just got the effects of the guy just going ah, ah, ah. So there are definitely moments that don't quite look good. I don't know whether that was the attitude back then, but that's just kind of how it is nowadays. But in terms of the overall effects, there is a real cleverness to them. They are really imaginative, especially with the way that you can't quite grasp like what shape the thing actually is, because it seems to contort and twist and become other things, to the point where it's like something opens and you think that like something's going to pop out, and then next thing you know there's other things that like crawls out, and then that opens up and there's something inside. It is really well done. It's impressive just how great this creature actually does look, especially considering that this was all handmade. It's a mixture of different techniques that they use to try and bring this creature to life, and it really does work very well. And again, there are definitely moments where it doesn't quite look right and it does look a little bit fake, but maybe that's just because of just the day and age that we're in, and we are able to sort of pick up things like this a lot easier. But it holds up well enough. It's shot brilliantly to the point where you could sort of say that it can convince you that maybe it's not as fake as you think it is, because there are a lot of shadows, there are a lot of times where it's just off screen enough that you don't necessarily see the whole thing of it, but it is still done really well. I think the sound design that they use for this creature is quite good as well, because they use like a lot of different sounds to try and help create whatever this creature's supposed to sound like. They use a mixture of like synthesizers, they use like different animals. I think they use like a lion's roar at some point, they use like birds and I think pigs squealing as well. It really does add together very well. It does make this sound so different and unique from other kind of creatures that we've seen before. It really adds to the otherworldliness of this creature because it does sound very unique. I have never heard a creature sound like this before. I've heard many creatures since definitely try doing something similar to this. That's one of the biggest things I keep saying, that there are influences from this movie that I have seen a lot more modern day stuff, and I think sound design is definitely one of them. Ennio Morricone does the music for this movie, and honestly this sounds very unique. It's kind of like a mixture of different things that you might have heard in the past. There's definitely echoes of things like Jaws in here with the like dun 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 dun, and it sounds really great. It does sort of like have a bit of a, it does have the horror sort of sound to it, but it's got this sci-fi edge to it as well, and it just sounds really great. Music's not too overpowering, it's got this very mysterious sort of tone to it. That really does sort of help enhance a lot of the dread and the just general aura of that kind of dread for this movie, because it really does help heighten a lot of those scenes, because it sort of holds off as much as it can, and then when things might start kicking off, you can just hear that dum dum, that heartbeat sort of like music, and it really does heighten a lot of the tension because it just works well for those kind of scenes, because it really does make you feel on edge whenever you hear that theme. There is quite a bit of mystery to this movie, because a lot of that is kind of built up around what the thing is, where it comes from, why it's here, and it doesn't necessarily answer a lot of those questions that you might have, but it does go some way in sort of answering like a few basic things here and there. And there's actually a scene right at the beginning of the movie that I actually would have cut out, because I feel like it kind of gets rid of a little bit of that mystery, because one of the first things that you see is a spaceship heading towards Earth. I actually am not really too sure on whether or not they should have included that scene in the movie, because I think that it does add to the mystery of what this creature might actually be, because you don't really get a pretty definitive answer until later on. I feel like that might have worked a bit better, because up until that point the creature could have been absolutely anything. I think that it could divide people onto whether or not it was extraterrestrial from outer space, or whether it was man-made, and that might have been like a big you know, we shouldn't play around with things that we aren't supposed to kind of thing. So I feel like that extra scene I think could have been removed, and it just sort of adds a bit more to the mystery. But that's me just being a bit picky. So honestly, everything else I am absolutely fine with. I think that's like the only scene I've actually really got any sort of issues with. When it comes to the movie overall, I think that this is genuinely a fantastic movie. I think for 1982, this is an absolutely brilliant movie, and the way that it is a great horror, it has a good mystery surrounding it, it's got some great characters, there's some great motivations, and there's a lot of build up and tension. The music, the effects, all of it does work very well. It is a little dated, and I can't really ignore that, especially for today, and that's like the only real issue that I've got with it. But other than that, this is a genuinely great movie. So with all that being said, my rating for this movie, I'm really debating with myself over what to give this one, because I really feel like I should give it one thing, but I sort of feel like I should stick with what my initial reaction was for this. So my rating for this movie is going to be a 9 out of 10. Honestly, it is genuinely great, and I am so close to giving this a full 10 out of 10, but I can't really ignore the few little dodgy things here and there, like some of the more dated aspects of it, and a little bit of that mystery that's sort of taken away at the beginning. So I'm really debating with myself whether or not to give this 10. So I'll probably be kicking myself when I'm editing this. So what you won't have seen is that I've basically been here for about half an hour just debating whether or not to give this a 9 or a 10. So be thankful that this is as short as it is. But honestly, this is a genuinely great movie. This is an absolute classic, and you do need to see it at least once. So I will highly recommend checking it out. It'll probably be one of those movies that when you see it, you'll start seeing a lot of those little influences from other things that you might have seen quite recently. So honestly, it is genuinely worth checking out. Well, that's all I've pretty much got to say for today. So as usual, thank you so much for watching. Please like, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions for any older movies or anything new coming out that you'd like me to take a look at and do a review for, let me know down in the comments, and I'll try and get around to them as soon as I can. Make sure you hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on this channel, because honestly, if you're just hitting subscribe, it doesn't really notify you on what it is that's coming out. So if there's a new video, you won't necessarily actually get a notification for it. So make sure you hit the bell and you will actually get a proper notification for it. And once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See ya.